In 1829, an entire people ceased to exist. Not gradually over centuries like most vanished cultures. Within a single lifetime, watched and documented the whole way. A nation that had lived on an island for thousands of years came to an end with the death of one woman in a hospital in St. John's, Newfoundland. Her name was Shanawdithit. She was the last known Beothuk. And unlike almost every other lost civilization this channel has covered, her story isn't a puzzle waiting to be pieced together from ruins. It happened recently enough and was documented closely enough that we know almost exactly how it happened, which somehow makes it harder to sit with. Not easier. For most of history, the Beothuk lived across the island of Newfoundland, following a seasonal pattern between the coast and the interior, hunting caribou, fishing and gathering seabirds. They descended from an earlier culture archaeologists call the Little Passage Complex, present on the island for centuries before sustained European contact began. They built lightweight canoes from birch bark, engineered with a distinctive raised ridge along the bottom that made them unusually stable in open water, and constructed cone-shaped or oval homes covered in bark and hide, arranged around a central fire pit. They covered their bodies, clothing, tools, canoes, and dwellings in red ochre, a practice so distinctive that some historians believe it's the origin of the term Red Indian, a phrase later misapplied to indigenous peoples across the entire continent, most of whom had no such tradition at all. Researchers still aren't entirely certain why the practice was so central to Beothuk life. Theories range from spiritual and ceremonial significance to practical uses like insect repellent, but it appears in nearly every surviving account and archaeological find associated with them. When European fishing crews began arriving on Newfoundland's coast in the 16th century, the Beothuk made a choice that set their fate apart from almost every other indigenous nation in North America. They avoided contact almost entirely. Most indigenous nations that encountered European colonizers engaged in trade, forming complex, often difficult relationships that at least allowed continued access to territory and resources. The Beothuk, by contrast, largely withdrew. As fishing stations expanded along the coast, the Beothuk were gradually cut off from the sea itself, one of their primary food sources, and pushed further into the island's interior, an environment that could support far fewer people. Historian Ingeborg Marshall, whose research remains the most detailed academic account of Beothuk history, documented the numbers behind this decline. An estimated 350 Beothuk in 1768, dropping to just 72 by 1811. In roughly one generation, the population had fallen by nearly 80%. Here's what makes this different from most stories of a vanishing people. This wasn't primarily a story of open war. Some conflict did occur, particularly disputes over trapping territory and fishing equipment between settlers and Beothuk families. But research on Beothuk remains has found less evidence of sustained, widespread violence than the popular narrative often assumes. What emerges instead is a slower, quieter collapse. A population pushed into marginal land, cut off from the sea, weakened by starvation, and then struck by diseases introduced by Europeans, smallpox, and eventually tuberculosis, against which they had no immunity at all. By the early 1800s, colonial officials in Newfoundland began attempting to make peaceful contact with the Beothuk, partly out of genuine concern and partly out of anthropological curiosity. It was, by most accounts, far too late. In 1819, an expedition seeking peaceful contact turned violent. A Beothuk woman named Demastuit was captured. Her husband, Nanasabasat, was killed attempting to stop it. Demastuit was brought to live among European settlers, where she was, by contemporary accounts, treated with genuine care and even affection. She was taught some English and reportedly grew fond of certain settlers who looked after her. She died of tuberculosis less than a year later, before authorities could return her to her people as originally planned. Her remains, along with her husband's, were later taken to Scotland. They were only repatriated to Newfoundland in 2020, almost exactly 2 centuries afterward. Shanawdithit and Shanawdithit were the aunt and uncle of Shanawdithit, who was captured herself in 1823, along with her mother and sister, while starving in the Newfoundland interior. Both of Shannedith's companions soon died. She lived the remaining 6 years of her life among European settlers in St. John's, working as a domestic servant. During those years, Shanawdithit did something remarkable, working with a Scottish-educated explorer named William Cormac, who had founded an institute specifically dedicated to making contact with any remaining Beothuk. She produced a series of detailed drawings depicting Beothuk tools, dwellings, mythological figures, and in stark and unflinching detail, the encounters between her people and European settlers, including maps of her people's final settlements and the deaths of her aunt and uncle. She also shared vocabulary and oral accounts, giving Cormac and later researchers one of the only substantial records of the Beothuk language, though it remains poorly understood today and may have been entirely unrelated to neighboring indigenous languages. These drawings, preserved today, remain one of the only substantial visual and descriptive records of Beothuk culture created by a Beothuk person herself, rather than filtered entirely through outside observers. On June 6, 1829, Shanawdithit died of tuberculosis in St. John's. She was around 28 years old. With her death, researchers and historians generally consider the Beothuk to have gone extinct as a distinct people, not a metaphorical extinction, but the actual end of a nation that had existed on that island for over 1,000 years, ending within the documented lifetime of a single generation of colonial administrators. There's a detail that complicates even this ending. In 1910, an American anthropologist recorded testimony from a woman living in Massachusetts named Santa Tony, who identified her father as Beothuk and her mother as Mi'kmaq. If her account was accurate, at least some Beothuk descent may have continued through intermarriage with neighboring indigenous nations, even after Shanawdithit's death marked the end of the Beothuk as a distinct, separately identifiable culture. The aftermath of Shanawdithit's death carries its own uncomfortable postscript. Her skull was sent to the Royal College of Physicians in London for study, then later transferred to the Royal College of Surgeons, where it was ultimately destroyed during the bombing of London in the Second World War. Well over a century after her death, in recent years, there has been a sustained effort to return what remains of Beothuk history and remains to Newfoundland, alongside a 1997 initiative to establish an institute dedicated specifically to preserving and increasing public understanding of Beothuk history and culture. What happened to the Beothuk isn't a mystery in the way an unexplained disappearance is a mystery. There's no lost city, no unexplained gap in the archaeological record. It's something arguably harder to sit with. A fully documented ending, watched, recorded, and in some cases even mourned by the very colonial society that made it inevitable, and still somehow not prevented in time. Officials wrote letters expressing concern, explorers founded institutes dedicated to peaceful contact, and the population kept declining anyway, generation after generation, until there was simply nobody left to make contact with. Every other episode on this channel has been about civilizations lost to time, distance, or the simple accident of not being written down. The Beothuk are different. Their ending is one of the most thoroughly documented indigenous extinctions in North American history, and that documentation doesn't make the loss feel smaller. If anything, knowing almost exactly how it happened, year by year, name by name, makes it feel closer. The Unwritten Record, some of history's biggest stories were never written down at all. Subscribe because the next lost chapter is coming.